Hi everyone, welcome to this Geekettes talk, how to build a better open source community. So today I would like to talk to you about building open source communities with access, inclusion, diversity, and equity at their core. This is what I mean by building a better open source community. Open source software refers to software in which source code is made available to others so that they may inspect, reuse, and modify it. Often, open source software is developed collaboratively in public. I believe that at its best, open source software is embedded in the communities that build and use it. However, there are many existing challenges in this space. There's gatekeeping, there's lack of mentoring, there's lack of funding, and there are codified biases. How can we, as maintainers who manage open source software and contributors who create code, documentation, and other resources as part of open source projects, work to make open source repositories welcoming spaces for developers and end users alike? So, to give you a little bit of the context that is informing my perspective here, I'm Lisa Tagliaferri. I build community and developer education resources for tech startups. I have built a lot of learning resources for Python in particular, and you can download my How to Code in Python or Python Machine Learning Projects books for free. My background is in research and teaching in higher education. I have a PhD in medieval literature, and I completed postdoctoral research in the digital humanities at Harvard and MIT. As part of the lab at MIT, I built open source software together with a team to support humanities research. Recently, I volunteered as a session lead as part of Stanford's Code in Place to teach Python to students around the world. And today, I'm coming to you as the New York City ambassador to the Geekettes. So, with this background, let's take a look at where we have come from and where we are going as a technological society. We all know that in the past 30 to 40 years, we have been experiencing a digital revolution as we move from analog to digital electronics. It may go without saying, but considerable change has been brought about by digital computing and communication technology in recent decades. In this chart, we can see the tremendous increase of worldwide internet users, this is calculated in millions, from 2004 to 2018. Currently, we are at 3.9 billion users worldwide out of 7.7 billion people in the world population. That's just incredible. Additionally, we see that the number of jobs in the tech industry has been growing. 1.6 million jobs have been added since 2010. That's pretty awesome. What about open source? The rise of open source repositories is tremendous. Many open source repositories or repos are now hosted on GitHub, a platform for collaborative software development. This chart shows the increase of software repositories that are hosted on GitHub from 2008 through 2013. It is not the only place to find open source repos, but this is indicative of the rise in software made available through open source licenses. If you thought 10 million repositories in 2013 was a lot, as of 2018, there are 100 million repos hosted on GitHub. Amazing. That all sounds really great, right? Except when we talk about people with access to the internet, with jobs in the tech industry, and those who are contributing to open source, who are we talking about? Internet penetration rates vary dramatically across regions. In North America, about 90% of the population has access to the internet, but in Africa, that number is below 40%. On an aggregate level, just under 60% of the world population has access to the internet. Tech industry jobs have been increasing. Who are getting those jobs? Looking at some major tech companies, Airbnb, Facebook, Google, etc., we see that men who are from well-represented backgrounds make up the vast majority of the workforce. Underrepresented people of color, here we're talking about Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and mixed race folks, are more underrepresented than you may think. Underrepresented women of color do not make up even 10% of the workforce in any of these 6 companies. Okay, this is industry. We hear all the time there are problems in sourcing and recruiting and hiring. So, what is it like in open source? Oh, it is 95% men. In a 2017 open source survey conducted by GitHub with partners in academia and industry, researchers found that open source is anything but representative of a diverse space. A full 95% of respondents to the survey were male. Only 3% identified as female and 1% as non binary. In terms of race, 16% of respondents to this survey said they belong to an ethnic or national groups that are in the minority in the country they live in. This does not look great. What do we do? Do we burn it down? What if instead we could imagine a more equitable future where we can ensure that the technology of tomorrow is built in service to everyone by making a commitment that every community is represented by stakeholders building that software? This is what a Digital Humanities Lab looks like. The digital humanities is a field that works to bring computational tools and methodologies to bear on traditional humanities disciplines such as literature, history, and philosophy. Funded by the Mellon Foundation, the Digital Humanities programs at MIT has proven itself to be remarkably positioned to promote diversity and support thinking across fields. Undergraduate students studying the computer sciences joined our lab focus on the humanities, an anomaly on campus, and were paid to contribute to open source software through the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program. The inaugural lab cohort's undergraduate population consisted of over 80% female students from a computer science population of only 40% female students, and nearly double the percentage of underrepresented minority students than there are at MIT as a whole. In this way, the lab and the software we shipped benefited from the innovative potential and knowledge sharing outcomes that are often out of reach for the markedly less diverse tech industry. We developed Python projects as a lab. This is the repo of our digital archive project built in Django that considers computational history from the mid-20th century based on paper archives in the library's special collections. While with the MIT Digital Humanities Lab, the diversity of the cohort was widely determined by who among MIT undergraduates applied to positions, Stanford's Code in Place specifically structured in equity. Code in Place was a massive open online course that was freely available in spring 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Out of 20,000 students who applied for spots, 10,000 were selected based on applications with problem sets. There were also 905 volunteer teachers who were section leading once a week. I was one of those volunteer teachers. The Code in Place community was spread throughout 6 continents in every time zone and almost in every country. As indicated in these charts, the cohort was majority women at 49.7% of the students identifying as women, 47.5% identifying as men, and 2.8% identifying as non-binary. Additionally, there was diversity in terms of age range, with nearly 1,000 students being over the age of 40, which is something that is unusual for a course in a traditional university setting. Code in Place purposefully structured inclusion into the class. It was extremely open to anyone over 18 who had the time and an internet connection. Notably, this is still a barrier for many in the world. There are also clear expectations. The class was just for fun. If you learned something, you have been successful. There were clear class values that were communicated to the students up front. Also, spread throughout the course were examples of how programming could be used in the real world, from art to medical innovations to points of sale applications. Though this is a class and not quite open source, I think we can extrapolate how openness, mentorship, values, and examples can support collaborative code environments and thus support community. Beginning with community is a good place to begin building out an inclusive repo. Having clear, accessible documentation in your repository that explains your project well and protects and incentivizes contributors is incredibly valuable. We'll go into a few of these documentation files in depth. Here we have readme.md, contributing.md, contributors.md, and code_of_conduct.md. The MD stands for a file type that contains a lightweight markup language called Markdown. A readme.md file is a file that describes the project and its goals. This file is usually initialized with a GitHub repo, but being deliberate in how you lay this file out can really support those learning about your project. You may think about providing a summary of the project, delineating your goals, describing how someone may install the existing project and letting them know what dependencies exist. A README file may be the only thing that a user reads out of all of your documentation. A good example of a README file is found in the PyTorch repository, which you can access on GitHub. A contributing.md file is there to provide instructions for potential contributors, helping developers understand the best way to collaborate on a project. You may also want to include specific style guidelines for your code base, or you can link out to a file with this information. Contributing files should have clear guidelines. They should help others understand best practices for collaboration. They should point to additional supporting resources. You may also want to include a code style markdown file to describe code best practices in the repo, or if there is some kind of in-house style. A good example of a contributing file can be found at the Jupyter Lab project. A contributors.md or authors.md file is there to recognize contributors. This may help welcome folks, and it may also incentivize community engagement. You can include contributors' GitHub profile pics as well. It is also important to remember those who contribute outside of the repository, such as administrators, funders, or others that are offering support that may not be in the form of a pull request. Some ways you may think about organizing a contributors.md file would be alphabetically. You may want to do it by the role that the person has, or group into separate teams depending on how big your project is. The Calligator repo is a good example. And some of what I was mentioning about including administrators and funders can be found in the Gender Novels project from the Digital Humanities Lab at MIT. A code of conduct.md file is increasingly important as it provides a statement that reflects the project's community values and sets clear expectations for all members. In addition to showing the values of the project and setting those expectations, it's important that there are guidelines in place for conflict resolution. It's always a good idea to think about that before a conflict happens. There's also a great opportunity to prepare this together with the community that you're serving or that you're working together with. Some good examples of code of conduct include the Contributor Covenant, Geek Feminism Code of Conduct, and the Drupal Code of Conduct. Here is an example from the Digital Humanities Lab. We collaborated on this document together. We used some of those codes of conduct that I mentioned as inspiration. Creating this document generatively at the community level and understanding that this document may be a living work in progress can serve to empower the community around your project. There shouldn't be a unilateral, this is the code of conduct and you must follow it, without getting consensus among your community and hopefully their feedback and their own contributions there. In addition to these files directed primarily to the developer community, some tutorial-style documentation for end users can help make an open source project more user-friendly and more widely adopted. These can include general overviews and FAQs, troubleshooting guides, release notes, and planned features. If someone in your community is feeling ambitious, you can also consider video walkthroughs or screencasts. By caring for both contributors and end users, maintainers can encourage more collaborations over time, thus ensuring that a given software project is serving its community well. That's right. We should dox all the things, but how? Make it a point to encourage documentation contributions. These contributions are among the most important someone can make to an open source repo. Even GitHub acknowledged that when they celebrated their 100 millionth pull request, which was a documentation pull request. For emerging developers, a pull request that improves existing docs based on their experiences using a tool provides an entry to get involved in open source. Creating an environment where people are equally acknowledged for code and documentation contributions and others besides can go a long way to building a community around a project. In order to support documentation contributions, it is important for maintainers to put in the effort needed to structure documentation in an inclusive and accessible manner, and to also seek out the diverse perspectives of others. Use language that is welcoming and unbiased. I understand that this is easier said than done, but try not to make assumptions about people, try to use gender-neutral words, and try to err on the side of thinking the best of others. One of the benefits of software is how it can be built from practically anywhere. Keeping distributed teams in mind is important, not just in an effort to create unbiased language, but also when thinking about supporting multiple natural languages. As some people may be interacting in their non-native language, you can work to have documentation that is clear and accessible across reading levels. Accessibility also includes those who use screen readers and those who may have other disabilities like color blindness. The A11Y project is a community-driven effort to make web accessibility easier, and they have good guidelines to follow. Open source repos tend to leverage issues as the main method to report bugs or request new features, often opened by community members. Maintainers who make an effort to organize and prioritize issues will provide the repos community with a solid roadmap of upcoming work on the project. Ensuring that issues represent concrete tasks and are not ambiguous can help contributors know how to approach them. Think about prioritizing issues based on what your project's needs are now, any dependencies or easy wins, and what your contributors can reasonably do at a given point in time. Issues can be organized into bigger categories, and they can be labeled more descriptively and project-specifically than the suggestions that are given in GitHub, for example. Tagging potential assignees to the issue can help you with delegation. Using issues as a place for conversation and exchange can help ensure that more voices are taken into account when deciding the future of the project. Here we have an example of labeled issues. We have bugs that are labeled, enhancements labeled, simulations, and a front-end label. One piece of advice that I learned while incorporating writing across disciplines in college classrooms was to remember that you are not the last person to teach something about writing to your student. I like to think of code reviews in a similar way, as long as it makes sense for the project. Code on someone's local machine is not useful for anyone else, so working to get that code merged should be a priority. Beginning with gratitude can put code reviewers in the right mindset when looking at someone else's code. Think about one or two key takeaways to provide as general feedback. When feedback needs to be specific, use line-by-line comments to call something out. Rather than nitpick in an initial review, create a dialogue and consider that your code base will always be iterative. Not everything will be perfect right now, but your project will continue to improve and evolve. Something to do throughout your open source maintenance practice is delegating tasks to others. Encouraging others to do code review can strengthen the community around the project. Here we have a few examples of code review through feedback. I understand that all of these suggestions require not only thoughtfulness, but considerable effort as well. As much as is possible, you should try to structure an automation alongside structuring an inclusion. Leveraging a testing suite like Travis CI or automating tasks with something like GitHub Actions can help reduce maintainers' cognitive load. Remember to put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. As a maintainer of a large educational repository for Hacktoberfest, Cloud Haiku, I have a huge set of saved replies in GitHub that are welcoming, inclusive, and have clear directions on what the contributors should do next. I use these to make responding to pull requests go much faster. Additionally, if open source is not your primary pursuit, be sure to time box it. Schedule time for maintenance, enforce boundaries, and create clear expectations for how long it may take for a pull request to be reviewed. Finally, something that is really important to think about with regard to open source is money. In the beginning of this talk, I laid out who is contributing to open source. That lack of diverse representation of contributors to open source projects is an indicator of who has access to free time and resources. Open source is often volunteer work, but it is important to keep in mind that open source has a very real business value. According to a 2016 survey, 96% of software products developed in that year relied on open source software. The time spent on open source can and should be thought about in economic terms. While this can be its own talk entirely, here are some places to begin looking into to fund your open source project. Consider talking directly to your own company. Pitch to leaders that you need funding, time, or other resources to carry out your open source project. Work to make a concrete business case for this and demonstrate how the software will support priorities for the organization. Foundations and organizations that offer grants are another avenue to investigate. Mozilla, Sloan, and language-specific organizations like the Python Software Foundation have grant programs that projects can apply for. Additionally, there are a few programs that help to fund open source, connecting students or interns or junior developers with projects and offering funding for one or both parties. Some examples of this are the Google Summer of Code and Outreachy. Additionally, you may want to think about creating a revenue stream. This may be through offering more support, more features, or other incentives to users. Have open dialogues with your community and see what is possible. Don't think that adding finances into the equation muddies your commitment to open source. Navigating this challenge well will do a lot to drive inclusion and equity within your project. So now what do we do? One thing you could start with is create an issue to implement some of these practices on repos you maintain. CockroachDB did this after hearing a version of this talk at Grace Hopper. Every year during the month of October, there is a program called Hacktoberfest, which is a celebration of open source software. If you're a maintainer of a repository, you can label issues with the Hacktoberfest label to help new contributors know what to work on. If you're more interested in contributing, you can submit quality pull requests to public repositories during this period to participate. If you've never contributed to open source before, I encourage you to contribute a haiku to our Cloud Haiku repository. You could find it by searching Cloud Haiku and GitHub or going into GitHub and calling up do-community/haiku. If you're more interested in writing about open source than contributing directly to repositories, there's a great Write for Donations program where you could write technical tutorials and get paid and get donations for nonprofits as well. If you're a teacher, I would encourage you to look up the Spin Up program. This will help this is a program to support underrepresented folks getting into tech with a focus on young people. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing all of the great inclusive repos you build.